Good evening, all, and welcome to Introduction to Philosophy. I'm Dr. Ryan Lozano. I will be your professor for this semester. Tonight, we are going to start right into our content with pre philosophic thought from the Upanishads to Homer and also discuss the Greeks. So, this pre philosophic thought is exactly what it sounds like. It's the thought that we engage in prior to actually doing philosophy. So, in the late 18th century and 19th century, a fascination grew up around the civilization of ancient Greece and the surrounding areas with the discovery of Crete and sites like we see here. So, what we've got are primitive Minoan boys leaping over bulls as part of a ritual. We also found things that showed us, well, a labyrinth. The labyrinth on the left is the kind that you read about in mythology. Not so much a maze, because in a maze, there may be various twists and turns and pathways to get out. In a labyrinth, there's only one way ultimately to escape the labyrinth, and yet that one way may lead inextricably to the center where a horrible beast, in this case a minotaur, awaits you. Now, the labyrinth on the right, I have to plug, because if you haven't seen this movie, you are remiss, and you need to add it immediately to your Netflix queue. So, about the labyrinth. The guy in the upper left-hand corner here is King Minos of Crete, who fought a war against the Athenians, defeated them, and exacted a yearly tribute of young boys who would come and be fed into the labyrinth to feed the Minotaur, who is his son. His daughter is standing behind him in the lower left-hand image there, where he is greeting the hero Theseus. And this daughter, Ariadne, would fall madly in love with Theseus, not want him to fall prey to the Minotaur, and so, as we see in the lower right, would give him this golden cord that he would take in with him. Spoiler alert, Theseus kills the Minotaur, and by retracing his steps, according to the golden cord of Ariadne, is able to escape the labyrinth. So in this myth, he's able to do this because of that golden cord, and this is really illustrative of kind of how we're going to approach the semester. Myths are a source of metaphor, and this cord of Ariadne is an apt metaphor for history. We solve a problem or a puzzle by retracing the steps that got us here. So the steps that we're going to retrace will take us along the history of great ideas. Central to this is what we're going to call the long debate. These are three overarching and interlocking problems that kind of guide us along the way. We're going to call these the problem of knowledge, the problem of conduct, and the problem of governance. The problem of knowledge, that's what's going to end up being epistemology and metaphysics, which we'll go into here shortly. The second of these, the problem of conduct, is ethics and moral philosophy. The problem of governance we find today in political science and jurisprudence, but this takes a long time to actually develop in human history. We start with this concept called mimesis. This is our tendency to try and act out those stories that we're telling. Hand talkers, like myself, we just can't tell a story without moving around quite a bit. We get dance, we get ritual. These types of things sort of explain the world in mythological terms, and we start to ask fundamental questions about the nature of things. We develop epic tales. The epic that's pictured here in the lower right is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which you should add to your bucket list. Read it before you die. You'll be better for having done so. Here we see Gilgamesh mourning his dead friend Enkidu. We're asking fundamental questions like, what is the world? What should I do? How should my life be ordered? For whatever reason, and we don't know exactly why, between about 800 and 600 BC, or BCE if you prefer, we get accounts like this showing up in Greece and in India. In India, we have the Upanishads. In Greece, we have Homer's epics. These are pre-philosophical reflections that ask some pretty heavy questions about the human condition and the point and purpose of life. These kind of give us the background folk wisdom or mythology of an age. What philosophy is going to do is come around and refine those things and get them a little more developed. So we're going together on a journey of about 30 different lectures that are going to suss out the long debate and talk about these three overarching primary problems. We're going from remote antiquity to the 20th century, and our guide is going to be this history of great ideas. So think about myth for just a moment and the purpose that myth serves. If I am a Well, I don't know, say a Viking living around 100 AD or CE if you prefer, and I step out of my hut or my longhouse and lightning strikes the ground in front of me, I'm probably not going to say that it's an atmospheric discharge brought on by a precipitation rich environment. I'm much more likely to go, somehow I have pissed off the god Thor. What myth then allows us to do is explain everyday occurrences in kind of grandiose mythological sorts of ways. What it also does is it helps us create and then preserve a kind of cultural civic coherence. If I believe in Thor and you believe in Thor, we're probably both Norse. If you believe in Zeus and I believe in Zeus, we're probably both Greek, and so on and so forth. So here you will have depictions of trickster gods. We've got Loki in both the upper left and the lower right hand corners. We've got Anansi, the spider god of West African and Caribbean mythology. And we've got the coyote, not just Wile E. Coyote, but coyote comes to us from various Native American traditions as a trickster god. What this does is it helps us kind of create this coherent relationship, not only between ourselves, but also with people in our past. Philosophy doesn't exactly do that, though. Philosophy tends to be sort of disruptive and problematic in this way. We're not essentially doing civic things. What I mean by this is, we're not going to start with a settled position on political and moral things and then figure out how we kind of shore up and enshrine that settled view. We're also not going to try to make each other more comfortable. Mostly what we're going to be doing is fairly disruptive, but it's also epistemological. What we're looking for at the end of the day is a search for truth. So, the questions that mythology sets out to answer are sort of like the problem that philosophy sets out to answer, and they fall into these three broad categories: our problem of knowledge, our problem of conduct, and our problem of governance. The problem of knowledge, pretty straightforward. How do you actually know anything? How do you set up and seek answers to your questions? So, long before philosophy shows up on the scene, practical knowledge is necessary. Which plants are safe to eat versus which ones will kill you? Which animals are okay to try and domesticate versus which ones will kill you? And so on and so forth. So when we get to philosophy, the problem's going to reach beyond practical stuff and kind of get into those abstract realms of things. Our problem of conduct: how should I live my life to live the best possible life? How should I go about making sure that my life is a good one, or at least a satisfying one? Should I just live in a way that maximizes my pleasures and minimizes my pains? What kind of person do I want to be? What sort of relationship should I have with other people that I encounter? Finally, our problem of governance: if we didn't know how to conduct our lives and we didn't know what we were capable of knowing, there really wouldn't be a problem to be solved politically. Problems of governance arise mostly at conflicts at the level of conduct. How do I come to be a unified people? How do I group myself with others? What's the basis on which I should select my leadership? If I don't like my leaders, how should they be resisted, revolution staged, radical upheavals fomented, and so forth? So long before what shows up as philosophy, we're asking questions of this sort, usually heroically, generally by individuals, groups of people, entire communities. Philosophy is a fairly late comer onto this stage where we're looking at knowledge, conduct, and governance. So we start with the Upanishads. This is a body of literature that's written by multiple different authors between about 800 and 600 BC in that area there in India that you see portrayed on this map. The etymology comes from the Sanskrit word that you see there, Upanisad, sitting down next to, like sitting down next to the master for instruction. These are, for the most part, going to pose philosophical questions, but they provide mythic answers to them. So some of the questions that they pose, we see and we probably identify closely with. Where do we come from? How do I explain the fact that some things live and other things don't? How did the earth get to be here? What about that stuff up in the sky? What kind of life should I be living? Why is there evil in the world? Central to the Upanishads is this idea that everything kind of partakes in this mystical force called the Atman. The blue symbol that you see here, that maybe your yoga instructor has tattooed, and maybe they know what it means or maybe not, is Om. This is the cosmic sound that the Upanishads and later Brahminic texts taught works through the universe to kind of keep it going. Each of us shares a little bit of this. We've got this breath of fire within us, and more on that here in a bit. We have soul within us. This is kind of the first appearance of the modern concept of soul. This is something that's part of us that was here before us and is going to be here after us. There's a sense that there's something identical in our life and the life of the cosmos. We're a microcosmic expression, then, of a macrocosmic reality. What this comes to do is say that Atman is not only fire and life and creativity, but also this Brahma, this kind of form of knowledge. Knowledge as a manifestation of the spirit and the soul. This then together is the stuff that makes life meaningful. Now, everything comes from this, even space itself. The cosmos, so the macrocosm within the microcosm, and so on. And this is about as much Eastern philosophy as we're going to do, so we don't need to dive too deeply down into the details. But in the Upanishads, we get this very distinctly Eastern culture. A lot of these civilized people then are going to accept these teachings on ethical grounds. The Buddha is going to come again later. The teachings are not really philosophy, though, in the developed sense of the word that we're interested in. If we move from the East to the West, we can see some of the same ideas from the Upanishads showing up in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey that are composed right there in the middle at about 750 BC. What moves the actors in Homer aren't things coming from above like the Atman, but something within themselves. So Diomedes, at one point, when he attacks a goddess, is said to be overcome by the Lyssa, the blind rage of the wolf. So I guess if you have a friend named Alyssa, you can inform her that her name means wolf's rage, which is kind of cool. The gods in Homer are kind of just big versions of us, and certainly big versions of the heroes. In other words, they've got all of the same sorts of qualms and quips and hang-ups that we do. They get jealous. They get desirous of intimate company of others. They get angry. They seek retribution and revenge. There's something that's really immediate about the Homeric epics. We're kind of on every page. There's no final answers to the questions of why things happen there. So why does the Trojan War take place? Well, in a nutshell, Menelaus's wife Helen gets stolen by Paris, one of the princes of Troy, and his brother Agamemnon says, hey, this is a great excuse to invade. It's that, but it's a lot more than that. It's not just the anger of the gods. It's not just the pride of men. It's kind of a whole bunch of things all brought to bear. The Iliad and the Odyssey, therefore, you should also add to your bucket list. Read it before you die. You'll be better for having done so. These are really open textured at an epistemological, an ethical, and a political level. That is to say, our problems of knowledge, of conduct, and of governance show up on every page, and they're a lot of the same things that we still struggle with. The problem of knowledge shows up there in the forms of kind of these delusional dreams, God sort of manipulating mortals, and so on. Conduct, should I give into my passions? Should I let my reason control? If so, how do I do that? With the governance, who's going to run this thing? Is it really the kings? Is it the fate? Is it the destinies? Is it some abstract concept of the power of law? So whereas the Upanishads would merge us with this eternal cosmic soul, the Iliad and the Odyssey, no, we're very much stuck on this earth. We are part of the rational, but we're also part of the passionate. So we've got this internal conflict taking place. Now, one of the characters that Homer gives us that we're going to return to with Aristotle and really throughout the semester is the most pathetic of all, the person that you absolutely do not want to be. This is the hearthless, lawless, stateless man. The hearth is representative of the home. That's the big stone that's at the base of your fireplace, around which the rest of the home is generally constructed. So to say this is to say that you're homeless, but it's almost deeper than that. It's not just that you're temporarily away from it, it's that you have nowhere to go back to. Edward Everett Hale, in his masterful novel, The Man Without a Country, illustrated this really well. And so I would highly recommend this very short book to you to give a read to. This sort of illustrates the importance of having a home, having a state. Kurt Vonnegut would pick up similar ideas much later on, and it's also worth a look. What the differences are here is that Aristotle is going to call what we've got going on, or what we're starting to get into, the contemplative life. Homer will say there's nothing worse than to be outside the civic order of things, to get separated from our people. The human condition, then, almost demands that we live within an active life in a settled community, a polis, as the Greeks are going to call it, in which we participate and we draw lessons. So a final thought about Homer is that everywhere in the epics, nature is kind of guiding this along. At one point, the ships that Agamemnon and Menelaus and Odysseus and Achilles and all of these guys are taking over to Troy are stalled. They're becalmed. There is no wind to row them. They run short of food. They suffer famine, and so on and so forth. And so in philosophy, at least in the earliest times, we're really going to see nature kind of guiding this through. By the time we get up to the 20th century, when we get to this fascinating character known as Ludwig Wittgenstein, he's going to say, look, as a philosopher, my whole job is to show the fly the way out of the bottle. If that seems kind of cryptic and strange right now, don't worry. It's going to make sense as we go on from here. Now, at each of these, we'll have questions considered. These are nothing that you need to provide a written response for. All these are to get you thinking about things in a way that's going to help sort of develop your thinking. If you understand the answers to these questions and you feel you can discuss them rationally and intelligently, then you've probably understood the lesson pretty well. If not, you may want to go back and read through the notes again or read through the original text readings. So next, let's talk about, did the Greeks invent philosophy? Philosophy gets created the very first time that the mind is able to turn from practical matters, avoiding danger, mitigating uncertainty, and turn to a form of critical inquiry. We're going to talk a lot about being critical or forming critiques in philosophy. Now, a critique in this does not mean that we're making fun of you or picking on you or something or pointing out some shortcoming. Rather, it means that we're destructing it. It's a destructive critique, we'll say. We're going to break it down to its constituent elements, examine them there, and then put them back together if we find them to be worth a damn, and hopefully in a way that we can scrutinize them even more closely and understand them better. The ancient Greek world is going to transform this inquiry from practical stuff or ritualistic stuff, we do these things to appease these gods, the end, and religious, into a form of abstract and theoretical thought, really kind of for the first time ever in the world. What we want to know is there something, or was there something special about the Greeks that allowed them to do this? The Greeks' relation to their gods, who have enormous but very limited powers and business of their own, was one possible influence. The religious establishment in Greece didn't really have a whole lot of authority to say, look, ultimately, this is this way or that is that way, in the end. Further, the Greeks had massive commercial and military encounters with other cultures, and this is going to lead them to new questions about social organization and brand new ideas. So whatever gets them to think about themselves in this new philosophical way, they're going to exert this very powerful influence on custom, on thought, and they're going to recognize that there's some things to think about that we simply haven't encountered before. So in a lot of the courses that we take during the course of our collegiate career, whether it's mathematics, biology, political science, economics, certainly philosophy, we always kind of go back to the Greeks as we search for its origins. On the right-hand side there, you see a map of Greece. And if you know how to read a map, you can see that it's very mountainous and there's not a whole lot of arable land, not a lot of farmland, lots and lots of coastline, but not a lot of other resources there. So some of the theories that came out is that, well, they had lots of sunshine, they had clean air, they had a slave economy, they had abundant seafood, and this gave them leisure hours where they could be lazy and they could think philosophical thoughts and not really have to do a whole lot. But other kingdoms, earlier kingdoms, had more resources, better resources, and never created philosophy. So we want to figure out kind of what it was that made them special. Now, before we address this, we need to figure out what is philosophy. In the lower right hand corner, superimposed over Rodin's The Thinker, you've got philosophia. Philo means love of, like Philadelphia. Sophia means wisdom. So, much like your friend Alyssa, if you know someone named Sophia, you can inform her that her name means wisdom. Why do we keep going back to the Greeks, though? There is no society out there that is so limited that we consider them as completely unphilosophical. So that means even in the most barbaric group of folks that we might find anywhere on the earth, someone among them probably asks some pretty heavy, deep questions. To have a society in the first place requires a recognition of problems and some ideas as to the solution of them. So why aren't we starting with Buddha or with Confucius? Why are we skipping over all of the cool things that were done in ancient Egypt or ancient India, aside from the Upanishads? We seem to be ignoring a lot of great literary works also. It's because there's a big difference between folk wisdom and philosophy. Philosophy tests our most fundamental beliefs, the most closely held truths, convictions, and values that you have. Philosophy is going to call into open question. Central to this is criticism. Now, generally speaking, we are critical of society, of received wisdom, and of ourselves. We're very good at being critical of society. If we weren't critical of society, things like Twitter and Facebook would not exist. Okay? We're fairly good at being critical of received wisdom. My professor said this, and he's stupid, so I'm going to discount it entirely. Or my parents said this, but they don't know what they're talking about. I'm going to discount it entirely. We're really not very good at being critical of ourselves because that's where we find those uncomfortable truths. We don't want to get too deep and introspective and discover that, we may be an idiot. Philosophy's purpose isn't to set out to solve practical problems. It's not going to feed you, clothe you, or shelter you, unless, like myself, you are a professional philosopher. It's certainly not going to solidify our civic bonds. A lot of the philosophers that we'll encounter ended up being, kind of chased down and killed by angry mobs. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, the philosophia, not because it's final, because we can stop after we get it, but because we might just get it right, even if what's right is kind of bad news. So in most settings, including the most developed, the most modern ones, philosophy is coming out of this need to have an intelligible world. We've got an overwhelmingly dangerous and uncertain world that we're surrounded with that we kind of mitigate through, things like traffic laws, seat belts, weather reports, and the like. The first time Homo sapiens ever dropped from the tree, and the first time children learn to speak intelligibly, they become philosophers. Why? Because they ask that all-important question. Why? Those of you who are parents who are listening to this, you recognize that your children are already philosophers. If they're above about 18 months to 24 months, they're probably asking why several dozen times a day. Only rarely, though, when the debate gets closely examined, when these really successful practical measures are carefully thought through, and we hold them up to critical scrutiny, do we start to do philosophy. Now, philosophy didn't begin with a need for the intelligible world. Okay? Instead, our need to understand our world begins because those pre-philosophical times are pretty scary. The pre-literate times are unpredictable. We've got a world of change and we have to make sense of it. The ancient Greeks felt themselves to be kind of uniquely outside of everything else. They were strangers in a strange realm. They were totally self-determining. They're among people whose behavior they don't understand, these barbarians. A barbaros just means someone who doesn't speak Greek, by the way. They've got oracles, they've got priests, they've got folk wisdom, they've got Olympian deities. But ultimately, there's no one to say, look, this is the truth. This is all you have to know. The way to understand for yourself, then, was to ask philosophical questions. So This is an ancient map of the world. And right there where you see the arrow pointing is Athens. They were at the center of it, of course. Now, all things considered, it's a fairly accurate map. You've got the Nile Delta, you've got the Tigris, the Euphrates, you've got the Danube there, you've got the Tiber, more or less where it actually is, the Caspian and Black Seas. You've even got the Strait of Gibraltar over there to the left. Not too shabby, all things considered. The first time that this rare form of inquiry really becomes common enough as to be identifiable is about 6th century BC in Greece. So let's look at an if-then statement. If it's fair to say the Greeks invented philosophy, then it's important to consider the social and the environmental conditions that may have favored it, or at least passively encouraged it, because it is kind of a rare thing to do. Earlier, and admittedly greater civilizations hadn't reached this academic level of inquiry. The ancient Egyptians were already ancient at this point. It's a common mistake to think that just because a civilization is great and is powerful, that it matches up with philosophy. That doesn't actually work. Great civilizations are great because they identify and they solve practical problems. They're able to clothe a whole bunch of people, feed a whole bunch of people, defend a whole bunch of people, etc. So every once in a while, wealth and power and patronage and some of these things come together and they do some pretty cool stuff. Artistic and literary merit. The Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Book of Life come to mind. Still not philosophy. So how do we explain Greek philosophy? How do we explain the tremendous influence it's had on Western civilization? Maybe it was the climate. The Greek Mediterranean climate is kind of like we have here in San Francisco. It's sort of 65 to 70 and sunny all year round. Are we jealous of them here in Texas or what? It's not really a slave-based economy because slavery was coextensive with civilization at this time. Everybody in the world had slaves, and most of them had more than the Greeks, so it wasn't that. Okay? It's not the Olympians necessarily. The Olympian gods really don't care much about human life if you read mythology, and so people are kind of left to solve their own problems independent of help from the gods. And the Greek religion wasn't an officially enforced state religion. So it's not that. Yeah, there's our Greek pantheon. Priests and cults managed the rituals, they managed the oracles, they knew, hey, slaughter this lamb and spread the blood in this way to appease this god, but they really couldn't answer philosophical questions. They didn't really have the approach to give final truths for anyone. We get philosophical approaches when religious authorities are not regarded as all-powerful and influential. So in one of Plato's dialogues that we unfortunately don't have time to read, but I would encourage you to find it on your own, called The Laws, he said we're the puppets of the gods, but the one string we can kind of yank back on is that golden cord of reason, kind of tying it back to our Ariadne myth. Now, Greek itself, the language, the writing itself, lends itself to a sort of analytic, to this particular way of thinking. In Isocrates, who's the dude pictured in the lower left there, he gives speeches, and these are masterpieces of rhetoric. He gives his Panegyricus, which basically these were just formal public speeches, not super long, but a little longer than, say, an essay. And he's talking about the Hellenes. Hellenes are Greeks. If you transfer from here to a four-year university, you may encounter the Hellenic League or the Pan-Hellenic League. That just means it's the Greek system, sororities, fraternities, and so on. Hellenes aren't a race, he says, but all those who share this philosophical and aesthetic outlook, this commitment to self-perfection. So what Isocrates says is philosophy is the source of these institutions that initially shaped Athens and then was given to the world by that city. And he's right. So here is the Greek influence in this blue all the way over here into the Black Sea. Really pretty impressive stuff. Our questions to consider for the ancient Greeks. Again, these are not anything that you need to do written responses to unless you would just really like to. These are simply to get you thinking about these topics, see if you can answer them intelligently, and with reference back to some of the text, perhaps. And that is where we will stop for this evening. And when we come back, we will talk about the pre Socratic philosophers. Thank you and have a great evening. Bye bye.